Okay. So hi everyone, happy Tuesday. So happy to present another episode of Paleoberg Seminar. And today we have Chris Harris joining us from the University of Münster, Germany. And today Chris will be talking to us about a case study in ichnology from the Upper Devonian in Gondwana. Um, so before we get any further, for those of you who are new, or joining us after a long time, we'll go over the format of today's seminar. We are having welcome and announcements right now, and which will be followed by the talk for 30 to 40 minutes. Then it will be followed by a moderated question and answer session. So don't forget to send your questions to the questions at PaleoPerks host, who today is Salman. So you can chat with a host and send your questions or post them in the chat, and we will collect them. And then Chris has agreed kindly to stay with us for an informal tea time after his talk. So, any early career researchers who are interested to know more about Chris's work or just want to talk about some things are encouraged to join. And a bit of housekeeping before we go to today's speaker. PaleoPerks values the participation of all folks interested in the paleo sciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. You shouldn't be able to unmute yourself for the duration of the talk, but in case you do, please mute yourself out of respect to our speaker. You can ask questions by chatting to the questions at PaleoPerks host or by using the raise hand function. If you face any technical issues in the Zoom room, please do not hesitate to reach out to the questions at PaleoBox host. We have closed captions built into Zoom. Use the CC button to show or hide them. And then PaleoPerks works in through the nomination of outstanding early career researchers in the paleo sciences. So you're highly encouraged to nominate anyone you know doing some awesome paleo work and would like to give us a talk. We also collect anonymous weekly feedback just to get an idea of the demographics and what our audience would like to see. So, the link to both the nomination form and the feedback form will be dropped in the chat shortly. Um, and now to our today's speaker. So, Chris Harris, he did his bachelor's from Rhodes University in South Africa, and then he got a PhD from the Wits University, again in South Africa. And currently, Chris is doing a postdoc at the University of Münster in Germany. So, Chris, um, I invite you to start your talk.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you for the nice introduction, Hannah. So, super excited to be giving a PaleoPerks talk, and I will be speaking about ichnology, the study of trace fossils, which is something that I did during my PhD. I didn't expect to spend so much time studying trace fossils, but it turned out to be a really exciting field of research that is maybe something of the art of doing sedimentology. It's where biology and sediments are interacting, and that's a very productive space. Currently, quite ironically, I'm working on the sedimentology of the early Archean, in which they were the only organisms they were microbialites or microbial mats. And so there is actually no such thing as a trace fossil in the Archean, as I will go on to explain. So without further ado, let me say thanks to my funders and let's get going. All right, well, this is a slightly more elaborate bio, but what it explains is that in between my degrees, I was also working at the Albany Museum in what was then called Grahamstown, and it's now Mukunda in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. It's a fairly wild, underdeveloped province with a lot of rocks. And that was where I sort of honed my trade: curation, fossil collection, excavation. And having volunteered in the museum for a number of years during my bachelor, I was eventually offered a job when the roadworks came to town. And so I was paid to go out into the field and collect fossils in and amongst all the excavator machines and blasting. And that was really where I realized the importance of fossils and traces and how all the evidence can lead to getting a better understanding of Earth history. So, um, so the outline of this talk is that I'm going to start with what motivates me to study trace fossils. Then I will be going into the geology of the rock unit that I studied during my PhD. Thirdly, I will briefly be speaking about ichnotaxonomy, and I'm only going to use two examples. Um, During my PhD, I have described 18 ichnogenera, or identified 18 ichnogenera, as well as 7 or 8 other kinds that I wasn't able to identify. So I'll just be focusing on these two today. And that will then lead me to my discussion and conclusions. And this was my original outline, which, as you can see, has been totally pruned. So to begin with, talking about housekeeping, in 2006, a uniform approach was suggested for how to do ichnotaxonomy, that is, the systematics of describing trace fossils. And ichnotaxonomy is a strange thing because we use the Linnaean system of taxonomy just as we do with animals, except to apply to markings left by the work of animals. And so we use ichnogenera, ichnospecies, ichno-families to understand better organisms and their behavior. And this creates a huge amount of problems. And this is really the paper, Bertling et al. 2006, that I would recommend, has most capably given a really good summary of how ichnotaxonomy should be done. So for those of you who are interested in doing ichnotaxonomy, I highly recommend this work. And it is pure coincidence that Bertling was here in the same institute that I'm at now. Now, Bertling, in that paper, in that paper, Bertling and his co-authors have outlined what a taxonomic character is in trace fossils. So, what criteria do we use to define trace fossils? And there are good taxonomic characters and there are bad taxonomic characters. And good taxonomic characters are the morphology of the trace. An example of a bad character would be what you interpret the trace-making organism to be. Ichnotaxonomy involves description and identifying behaviors, but not necessarily being able to infer what type of animal made it. And furthermore, many different kinds of animals can potentially make the same kind of trace. So in the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature from 1999, a trace fossil is defined as the work of animals. And according to Bertling et al., this was problematic because you can also have trace fossils made by plants or fungi. So really, this is a foundational work, and I would suggest anybody to go and read it. I became inspired to study trace fossils whilst I was employed as a paleontological heritage monitor out in the roadworks. A set of fossil shales out in the Eastern Cape were being destroyed by roadworks, and SANRAL, the South African National Roads Agency, really supported us to be out there, myself and my paleontology mentor, Dr. Rob Guess, to go there and collect fossils. And so whilst I was watching about 1 million cubic meters of rock being demolished and trying my best frantically to collect fossils, I really started to understand that, or I began to realize how little I understood about the rocks that are being destroyed in front of me. It took me several months to realize that this huge quarry that was being opened up by the roadworks was actually overturned. So these rocks were upside down, and the younging direction was towards the bottom of the quarry. And a few times a week, I'd been walking right over the center of a fold axis, which is enlarged here in this photograph. And these rocks are all folded in what we call a syncline. And the folding is so tight that there's hardly a change in dip direction. The day that I noticed this, that was a bit of a wake-up call. So here we are in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, and this is a rock unit known as the Witpoort Formation, which is reconstructed as having been within the late Devonian South Pole. Unfortunately, due to all this structural complication, we were not able to anchor the fossil site within a reliable stratigraphy. And so we sort of published the site as existing somewhere down in the lower middle of the Port Formation. And I won't go into our reasons for having put it there, but I'm starting to doubt that that was correct. During my PhD, I did not revisit the stratigraphy of the site because of how bad the structure actually is. But what we did get was some really nice late Devonian plant fossils, including a typical tree from the late Devonian called Archaeopteris. And this is a species as yet only known from South Africa called Archaeopteris notoceria. And here are its fertile cones. And then we also found seaweeds, which indicated perhaps a connection to the open marine system, as well as a whole community of these bivalves in their living position. Further down the road, as the roadworks expanded, they opened up another site, which had brachiopods. And these are a very special kind of brachipod. They have often been referred to as living fossils. They are lingulate brachiopods, and they're the only type of brachipod that really lives in a burrow. And their burrowing habits makes them one of the most evolutionarily successful organisms that has ever existed. They've been around for 500 million years, since the early Cambrian, doing the same thing, basically. And only by studying the muscle scars do we realize that they have actually evolved over time, but they just literally seem to be, I guess, if one defines success as doing the same thing, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Unfortunately, the site we were able to anchor stratigraphically, as the base of the Port Formation was here in a fairly continuous section, so that we could say that the site with the lingulates was about 80 meters above the base. Sanrail then commissioned an artist for us by the name of Maggie Newman to paint a reconstruction of the site, and this is an early reconstruction. As you can see in the background in this lagoonal environment, there's a fish. However, we had found no fish fossils, but we only had the traces of them, and therefore inferred perhaps that it was a fish a bit like an Arthrodire placoderm that had been pooing on the substrate and had left these lovely coprolites. As you see here in F, there's a fish coprolite. We went on later to actually discover the only fish fossil known from the Witpoort Formation outside of the site's Waterloo farm, and that was the skull of an Arthrodire placoderm. And that discovery was only made, after this painting had been made. So it was really nice that ichnology could have predicted what types of vertebrates were inhabiting the ecosystem. And then we had a whole bunch of other trace fossils, including lingulate brachiopod burrows, this weird thing called neurites, and these surface trails that are very, very interesting that seem to be crossing some kind of interference deformation patterns that could be caused by microbial binding of the sediments. And in profile here, we can see that these beds that the traces occur in are very thin, sort of undulatory. Now, Waterloo Farm, which I just mentioned, this is basically before Coombs Hill and Rabbit Ridge were discovered. This was the only real fossil site that we had from the sort of high latitude late Devonian, and it is a phenomenal site. It's a Lagerstätte. It contains the only tetrapods known from the Devonian high latitudes. It has the oldest lamprey in the world, which is this weird blood-sucking thing over here. That's a tiny little baby Arthrodire placoderm there. I think that thing's about maybe half a centimeter or a centimeter long. There's another type of juvenile placoderm, and that is the pincer of a scorpion. So fantastic. We also has a full flora, and in fact very comparable to what we found at Coombs Hill, but obviously much better studied. So I made it my business to study the stratigraphy now that we have various fossil sites and to understand how they all relate to each other in age. And this is a map of my PhD study area, again, reconstructed southwards of 60 degrees south during the late Devonian. And this is Torsvik and Domia and Torsvik's 2004 paleomagnetic reconstruction. The Witpoort Formation sits here up near the top of the Cape supergroup. It's thought to be late Devonian or Furmanian in age, based on correlation to the global sea level curve. And the Cape supergroup is incorporated within this Cape Fold Belt system. And here we have the eastern sector, right on the eastern limit of the Cape supergroup. And this is a problematic area because, as you can see from these thickness figures here, in the Western Cape, they're normal. And in the Eastern Cape, they have been inflated by almost double. Now, that must mean there's some kind of weird subsidence-related thing going on. Maybe there's faulting in the basin. But no, in fact, structural geologists have already shown that this is the case with all units throughout the Cape supergroup, that they appear to thicken to the east. So it became important to revise this and to understand better how the stratigraphy is operating. So I went and located sections that had recognizable stratigraphic contacts and ones that I could anchor stratigraphically. I studied the structural geology, where there was folding, duplication of strata, faulting, and basically made sure that I did my due diligence to pay attention to wherever there was stratigraphic damage to the strata. And in doing so, built a stratigraphic framework, which included the Waterloo Farm site, which I now propose is older than it had previously been thought to be. Dr. Guess thought that Waterloo Farm was right up near the top of the Port Formation until I came along. And then Rabbit Ridge, the youngest brachiopods in the Cape supergroup, and maybe the last evidence of an open marine connection there, as well as these other sites, including this beautiful continuous reference log that has the whole of the Port Formation shown in one exposure, 350 meters thick. So, studying the sedimentary facies and doing a facies analysis, I came up with a depositional model. This is not my depositional model. This is one that was published this year from the early Devonian in Germany. Actually, another Lagerstätte and also maybe a comparable type of depositional system where you're having these Eurypterids and these armor-plated fishes, as well as scorpions. And this model that was proposed by Porschmann explains a lot of the types of depositional systems that we're seeing. However, I would like to make one modification with a barrier. The depositional systems in the Port Formation seem to be more of a wave-dominated type of setup with a barrier enclosing the lagoon and estuary, which protects it from open marine wave energy. And furthermore, I've recognized facies that indicate deposition in fluvial braided rivers, bayhead deltas, tidal marshes and estuaries and lagoons, where we're getting our fossiliferous black shale deposits, as well as beach barrier systems. I forgot to mention earlier that previous research on the Witpoort Formation had interpreted the Witpoort sandstones as an open marine system. However, my analysis has, I believe, refuted that idea. And here is a log of all the trace fossils that I found during my study. As you can see, this Rabbit Ridge site and Waterloo Farm have got the most elaborate ichno-diversity, and that is because we did systematic excavation at those sites, whereas the remainder of these ones had been located whilst I was busy logging the outcrops. This is the first time that trace fossils have been described in the Witpoort Formation. Previously, during his master's, Rob Guess identified that there were two types of traces, Spirophyton and Cruziana at Waterloo Farm, and one or two dissertations here or there have pointed out that there were burrows, but mostly traces have been regarded as bioturbation or just in general absent. This shows that in certain horizons, trace fossils are actually quite prolific. And my environmental or my depositional model proposes that in each and every case where we're finding traces, they are occurring within the estuarine realm, but never in the fluvial system as recorded by this yellow. And that's very interesting. I wonder to what extent that is preservation bias or the fact that organisms weren't really able to live or be active in the fluvial systems in those probably quite harsh polar environments. Based on this whole ichno-diversity, one might interpret the Witpoort Formation as an open marine system because many of these taxa are quite classic marine traces. However, if we take a closer look, we might get a better idea. So once again, at Rabbit Ridge, we have these thin undulatory sandstones with quite low angle cross stratification and parallel lamination. That would be a kind of upper flow regime, very high energy shallow water system. And here, the slab has got traces on both sides. Now, I wonder if you can tell which is the top and which is the bottom, because we found this actually in a pile that had been tossed there by an excavator machine. And so it wasn't immediately apparent which way was up, but the traces then told us. And very similarly at Waterloo Farm, these thin undulatory laminated sandstones, and they occur just like at Rabbit Ridge, directly underlying the main shale. And here on the base of this bed, we see a trace that I wasn't really able to confidently identify, but it fits a morphotype that's a lot like that Nereides that I showed you at the Rabbit Ridge site, as well as this wonderful little thing here called Cruziana problematica. Now, most people would assume that Cruziana is a marine trace formed by trilobites. However, Cruziana problematica is most common in its tidal and non-marine environments, and is probably formed by a very trilobite-like organism called a isopod. And then at Coombs the site that I originally worked on in 2016, we have a very similar setup here with these quite clean sandstones with a transition interval here, a fairly thin interval with a sharp contact leading into this pure mud, basically. And this is where we're finding all those wonderful plant and bivalve fossils. And this interval here is where I've been finding a lot of traces, including these funny plug-shaped types of burrows. And the tops and bottoms of beds are sometimes very, very strongly bioturbated with quite typical bivalve locomotion and resting trace called petichoplasma. And here we see an example of petichoplasma on the bottom of the bed with what seems to be a vertical burrow attaching to the surface from the bivalve trace. Okay, now to take a look into ichnotaxonomy. This is one of the most classic ichnotaxa that you will have heard of in your undergraduates in geology, Pseuphicus. Originally described based on this specimen, which was designated as the type ichnospecies. That type was then synonymized with an extant algae, and so Pseuphicus became typeless. However, in 1858, things were a little bit less modern. In fact, Darwin hadn't yet even published his Origin of the Species. So Massolongo's collection in Italy was then revised and a new type was brought to the surface. However, it took more than 150 years for that to happen. And only in 2007 did Oliveira go and look at the remains of Massolongo's collection, which had also been damaged in the war, and came out with a new type for Pseuphicus. In the meantime, Adolf Seilacher has identified, or he has described, archetypal ichnofacies, or assemblages of trace fossils that can tell you how deep you are in the marine system. And this is basically the original work that led to the classic taxonomic model of ichnofacies. And then, published in Nature in 1988, Boccia et al. Went and refuted this idea that Pseuphicus is a typically deep marine trace. They showed that in the Paleozoic, Pseuphicus tended to occur far more in shallow marine environments, and later, only after the Paleozoic, did Pseuphicus migrate down into the deep marine system, where it still lives today. And the fact is, we don't know what made Pseuphicus, and it's living down in the deep sea today, but more on that. In the late Devonian in New York, there was another kind of trace called Spirophyton that was then described, and Molly Miller in 1991 tried to make an analysis on what the environmental differences were between Spirophyton and Pseuphicus, which never seemed to occur together. And although they're quite similar, she also described how they are different and explained perhaps an ecological reason as to why Spirophyton and Pseuphicus don't live together. Spirophyton may have been a more marginal marine or a brackish water type of trace. as opposed to Zoophycus, which is a more normal marine salinity type of thing. So now that a lectotype species of Zoophycus has been identified, we now know what it is. And this trace, which is now thought of as being a bit of a waste basket, or it includes such a large variety of material, well, we can finally refer to what Massalongo's original intention was when he created the name. And here is Zoophycus. This is looking at the bottom of a bed. And this is an example from the Vidpoort Formation that uncharacteristically seems to increase upwards in diameter. Zoophycus is relatively large. It gets up to more than 30 centimeters in diameter in my study area, and I've been able to measure it as up to 25 millimeters deep. So what Zoophycus does is that it's an animal that is exploiting the sediment in a helix going round and round and round and round. Was the trace created from the top downwards or the bottom upwards? That is still debated. However, in the types of environments that we're finding them in, estuaries, where the depositional rate is very high, it would actually make sense for the animal to be making its burrow from the bottom up. And as sedimentation happens, the animal can move upwards. So there's our Zoophycus, and we have some very many nice examples of it, and they seem to be surviving pretty well in estuaries in the Vidpoort Formation. However, Zoophycus is only restricted to the lower Vidpoort Formation at around the same level where we get the last brachiopods in the Cape supergroup. As we know, all brachiopods are marine. Zoophycus is different from Spirophyton in that Spirophyton always has a perfectly circular outline, or nearly perfectly. Here's an example of two varieties of Spirophyton, which are exactly the same thing from Waterloo Farm. It's just that the rock has parted perfectly along one of the layers of the helix, and the other one is broken through several, creating this sort of concentric effect. This is an example which I'm not sure if those of you can see, but this trace is being built from the bottom upwards. And furthermore, what we get in each of these things is almost a little nipple in the center. That is what I have called an axial peak. That is supposed to be where the tunnel that connects the animal to the surface goes. However, I see no evidence of a tunnel, because right next to the trace, an underlying burrow has here created its tunnel to the surface, and it's a much wider, more prominent thing. So Spirophyton is separated from Zoophycus in always being less than about 8 centimeters in diameter, and it's very cute and ball-shaped. In the Vidpoort Formation, Spirophyton is only found at the Waterloo Farm site, but it's also found in underlying strata. This is the specimen that shows where there's a layer of these Spirophytons. You can't see them very clearly. And then on the overlying bed, there are all these opening burrow tops. And to me, this is proof that Spirophyton was making its burrow from the bottom upwards, for what it's worth. Now moving on to this other thing called Nereites. Now Nereites is also one of Psilaca's archetypal ichnofacies and also a deep marine type of trace. And when I presented this at an ichnology conference back in 2017, a very famous ichnologist stood up and told me that is not Nereites. However, almost 10 years down the line, and I still maintain that it is. And in fact, these Nereites seem to grade between different species of Nereites, from the uniserial kind to the biserial kind. There's Nereites jacksoni, there's a Nereites missouriensis type, and then there's one that doesn't really resemble any known ichnospecies. And these all occur in the same beds. And my argument is that they're all preservational variants of the same type of activity by the same organism. So if we had to follow the Bertling et al. Scheme, we would actually assign separate names to each of these varieties, and rather than trying to give them all one name. However, I've decided, according to Bertling's recommendation, to just leave them in open taxonomy and call them Nereites ichnospecies. So, to start concluding my talk, I asked the question, can we infer paleo-environment from traces? And I have already shown you that finding a trace that fits an archetypal paleo depth scheme is it's risky. It can be problematic, and particularly in the Paleozoic, where animal evolution hadn't progressed to the state where the Zoophicus and Nereides trace makers, for example, had not yet been forced down into the deep sea, and they were able to thrive in all kinds of shallow marine environments. However, there are ways in which one can tell between a deep marine or an intertidal Nereides. And Seilacher almost went as far as I have, where he described deep marine Nereides, where with the very slow, quiet, gentle uh, settling out of suspended sediment, the animals have a lot of time to systematically exploit the sediment surface. And these things are cruising around, eating sediment, basically, and leaving behind their burrows or their fecal trails. Whereas in the shallow marine realm, Seilacher found that the Nereides is a lot more morphologically variable, and the traces tend to be shorter and less systematic, and that is consistent with a higher depositional rate. In the intertidal realm, it's an even more extreme case where they're highly morphologically variable, very short, and these animals seem to be able to move up and down within the sediment during sedimentation. So another point that my study on ichnology has raised is that the salinity levels are a very important control on trace fossil distribution, and that studying the trace fossils can help us reconstruct what types of systems we might have been dealing with, whether open marine, maybe hypersaline, as in a cut-off lagoon, or perhaps brackish or with reduced salinities where a river mouth flows into the lagoon. And that can also then help us decide whether we're looking at a continental or perhaps a marine depositional system, which is not always the easiest thing to tell. So my conclusion is this. Accurate taxonomy, ichnotaxonomy, is critically important. And in my next slide, I will go on to make a few last speculations. But before I do that, I just want to mention that Thomas Becker here, who's one of the Devonian legends here in this institute, has told me about this film called Volcanoes of the Deep Sea, where our famous Adolf Seilacher, who described these archetypal ichnofacies, decided to commission a submarine to go down to the deep sea and find out what made some of these things. In particular, he targeted a well-known deep marine trace back in the Mesozoic called Paleodictyon. Makes a sort of syntoptic pattern, and I think one can see that even in the scheme. Paleodictyon, it's this thing. And he went down into the deep sea and collected them and found out exactly what animal was making them and how. So I have not yet watched it, and I haven't got a copy of this, but if anybody knows how to access this film, I would love to have a peek. All right, so the Witpoort Formation. Where we have excavated fossil localities, we get the most robust ichnological information, obviously. Wherever we find trace fossils, they are in very low ichnodiversity, bedding parallel, grazing trace assemblages. So although the types of traces are fairly various, if you look at one bedding plane, it will tend to be just the same kind mostly, or maybe 1 to 3 ichnotaxa. And these are the types of traces that fit this behavioral pattern. Cruziana problematica, Nereides species, Samichnites and Plexus, Ptychoplasma exsulsum, amongst others. So the predominant behavioral strategy is shallow informal grazing, moving and eating at the same time, grazing. And vertical burrowing in the system seems to be quite a rare thing. We do find it, but normally it's also with only one type of burrow and not extremely abundant. The very mature quartz arenite facies have no trace fossils, and this is probably the strongest evidence against them having been deposited in an open marine short-face type of system, because short faces do tend to have a lot of suspension feeding burrows. And then our ichnoassemblages tend to occur within the sandstones immediately underlying our fossiliferous shales, and that is a pattern that fits with the depauperate or proximal Cruziana ichnofacies, which was described by Boitois et al. 2005, I think, were the first. And this is very consistent with the brackish water estuarine system. Furthermore, estuarine deposits in the Carboniferous of North America show a lot of overlap with what we're finding in the Witpoort Formation at the ichnogenus and ichnospecies level. And this indicates to me, perhaps if I have to speculate, that when the end Devonian mass extinction happened and the climate cooled and we had the first glaciation since the Silurian, or since the end of the Ordovician, because of that cooling effect, organisms at high latitudes had to move towards the equator. Things at the equator went extinct, and the recovery biota was brought in by the Witpoort from did I say from the Witpoort Formation? From the southerly regions of Gondwana, exemplified by the Witpoort Formation and other contemporary strata. And this idea is not my own. It has already been suggested by Rob Guess, based on bivalves that he described with Frank Schultz, and that is Schultz and Guess 2017, if you're interested. So there is a list of 4 key papers that I've spoken about, and that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. This was a great talk, very fascinating, and loved all the rock pictures. And I would like to remind our audience that you can ask questions to Chris about his talk right now, and by sending questions to the questions that PaleoPerks host if you want to remain anonymous, or you can just directly post your questions in the chat if you don't want to be anonymous, and or you can raise your hand and we can allow you to unmute. um, so having said that, we already have some questions from our audience. um, and so the first question is asking, have there been other stratigraphic models which include the effect of beach barriers on the wave energy and sediment depositions from other regions or other time periods?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Sounds like it's coming from a sedimentologist. The impact of high energy in beach barrier facies, would this be in relation to the amount of marine energy that is coming into sort of the river mouth or the estuary?
Yeah,
Um,
I think this question is just asking if there were other models about, or like stratigraphic models which include a beach barrier in this.
yes, yeah. So there was a very nice paper by Robert Dalrymple, 2015. Yeah, I don't have the reference offhand. I think it was in one of those SCPM special volumes where he described the different spectra of estuaries that are controlled by tidal forces, wave energy, and river energy. And there's a whole spectrum of different types of estuaries. Where wave energy exceeds tidal forces, then you get a closed mouth estuary, and where tidal forces are more powerful or have greater energy than wave forces, then you'll tend to get a tide dominated open mouth estuary where you're getting a more heterolithic tidal flat type of system. And the wave dominated estuary tends to create a closed mouth, which causes very clean mud settling, like what we're seeing in the Witpoort Formation. I hope that
Okay.
answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you. And we have a next question, which is saying, thank you for such a great talk. You shared a lot of instances where your observations disagree with previous observations. So, can you tell us more about this consensus
Hmm.
making
Yes.
process?
All right. No, I think that's a very interesting point. In fact, apparently Adolf Seilacher himself loved controversy, and he used to invite his academic nemesis to the field with him to go and have great arguments. I think that for me, the scientific process is a deductive one where one is looking to refute hypotheses, and it's basically the last man standing, where a hypothesis that after having undergone every rigorous assessment and every attempt to refute it still stands, well, then that must be the truth.
Aha. And so until then, it's just like, working through the deduction uh, process and just sitting with the confusion, I
I
guess.
mean, I spoke about Adolf Seilacher. I mean, in many instances he was wrong, but his
Mm,
research, he is the greatest ichnologist of all time. He's like the Charles
right.
Darwin of ichnology. And yeah, I mean, I think that he would be a person who would be very happy to be wrong if he could be shown evidence against his
Hmm.
ideas.
Well, thank you. That was a very valid answer. Now we have another anonymous question, which is asking, would you say preservation largely parallels phases, or was the quality of preservation consistent across this formation?
Mm. Wow, that's a very deep question.
Yeah, Kate Pipinger has asked this question. Um,
Yeah, that's just a very thought-provoking idea, and perhaps if you're going to be attending the tea afterwards, I think that would make a really good kind of fruitful discussion.
Sorry, yes, I can I actually have to go, but maybe we can chat another time because I think this would be a super interesting thing to talk about.
okay, no, I mean, you can like ask your question right now again if you want to chat for a little while. We have the time.
Yes, yeah,
Uh,
certainly.
yeah, sure. I can clarify what I'm asking as well, if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Please do.
I guess I'm thinking about like you have a wide range of paleo environments preserved in this environment in this formation, right? You have your more sort of marine, you have your brackish ones, and I'm wondering
Mm.
if you see changes in the sort of like sharpness of these trace fossils in their quality of preservation that is based on the environmental variation, or if you think in general. I mean, the photos you showed are fantastic. Like, clearly, this is a really beautifully preserved site. But I guess I was wondering if you see any environmental variation in the quality of that preservation.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I mean, for one, trace fossil size is the thing. So, although Bertling et al. Are very strong against doing ichnotaxonomy based on size, um, Spirophyton is basically a small form of Zoophycus, and that, in my opinion, could be related to reduced salinities affecting the behavior of the same organism. Although in ichnotaxonomy, we never really ichnotaxonomy is not done based on assumptions about what made a thing. So yeah, I mean, I think there's really good analogs around the world. You know, the Catskill Formation in the New York State is a very nice comparative analog, and they've also got Zoophycus and Spirophyton there. Again, making comparisons with the Carboniferous estuarine systems, yeah, we see a lot of parallels, but there are also differences. And I think the first thing to do is to do good ichnotaxonomy and to describe the variations that we're seeing, whereupon then uh, we can get a better understanding of how the whole system is operating. But I think your question really deals with stuff that is at this point beyond my understanding.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an awesome site, and really, really cool work. So thank you for answering my question. And I think the
Uh,
spirophyton stuff, you're so right about the spirophyton Zoophycus divide as well.
really, I'd love to talk to someone who's actually been out there and found these things in the field in the Catskills.
Yeah, I've done a lot of my PhD work is looking at Devonian trace fossils in New York State. So maybe we can exchange emails or something like that. I do have to run now, but it would be great to chat more about this.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Kate. Would love to. Yeah, please. My email is on the title slide.
Yes, I got it. I'll send.
Well,
Yes, I got it. Sorry.
Okay.
well, awesome. Thank you, Kate, for asking your question, and thank you, Chris. Uh, we have another question, and this is from Yusuf, and they are asking, what do you think is the biggest factor affecting the accuracy of ichnotaxonomy? Also, is it more difficult to identify trace fossils in areas with a history of active tectonics?
Oh, wow. Interesting. So one thing in an area with a history of active tectonics, it's much easier to reconstruct the depositional history when you have trace fossils because they make fantastic way up indicators. So if rocks have been overturned, look at the traces and you'll see. Yeah, but to deal with your actual question, what is the main factor affecting the accuracy of ichnotaxonomy? And I have not published yet my ichnotaxonomic monograph, so I think this is something that I'm going to learn a lot about. But what I realize is that each ichnotaxon could be a monograph in itself. It takes a person with an incredible taste for systematics to be able to go in and look at 100 years of literature on Zoophycus or Samachnites or whatever, and really pull out what was meant in the original description that gave way for that name. So you've got to go back to the type specimens. And so what happens is that problems that accumulate over the years get compounded because you just read the most recent review, which relies on the most recent review previous to that. And so, yeah, I have a lot of respect for the authors of the Bertling et al. Paper. All of them are fantastic. Richard Bromley, Alfred Uchtmann, Schlerf, Andrew Runsberg. These are the people who have actually gone into museum collections and made deep dives into this stuff and have done us a great service. So, yeah, Yusuf, I can really recommend that you go and check out that paper if you're interested. I think I'm not sure if my screen is still shared here.
It is being shared. Just wait.
So
I
this
will.
is the paper here: Bertling, Brady, Bromley, Demetrio-Ganis, Nicholas Nielsen, Runsberg, Schliff, and Uchtmann. These are really, really top people. Yeah, highly recommend that paper. And Bertling tragically passed away 3 years ago, and I never got to meet him, but he seems like he is a very, very good ichnologist. Wow.
Well, yes, thank you, Yusuf, and thank you, Chris, again for
Yeah.
answering the question. We just have, uh, I guess, two more questions. If, yeah. Okay, so I think this one is, what are some of the most common challenges you face in arranging the rock fragments chronologically?
In dating the rock.
Yeah, in dating the rock,
Mm.
because you
Okay.
said you're collecting them
Yes.
from queries.
Yes. Yeah. No, that I mean, I really didn't go into any detail about how we think the Wittwood formation is actually Flaminian in aged Flaminian, which is the last stage of the Devonian. We know with quite a high degree of confidence where the Devonian Carboniferous boundary sits because global sea levels rose suddenly at that time, and everywhere we basically, I mean, aside from areas that were heavily affected by tectonics, we get a big transgression. And so at the top of the Wittwood formation, you go from sandstone dominated to shale dominated, and that is more or less, give or take, the Devonian Carboniferous boundary. The bottom of the Wittwood formation, however, is more difficult to date. It seems to be some kind of a global regression that happens in the Flaminian, coincident with climate change and global cooling. So the sea levels were falling as glaciers started to build up, right? And that's also very controversial. But biostratigraphy would be probably the best bet for us. And we're now starting to look into doing more palynology. Someone I know, one of my former supervisors, is doing some detrital zircon work. And we're basically trying everything that we can. But for now, Waterloo Farm contains the last appearance of placoderms, and placoderms went extinct at the end of the Devonian. So I think, aside from many other lines of evidence, I think that in itself is a very strong reason as to why the Wittwood formation is terminal Devonian.
All right, thank you. Uh, Now we have another question. And this will be our last before we go into tea time. So Rose is asking, how have you used ichno disparity to group morphological plants? If so, how do ichno disparities and ichno
Mhm.
diversity vary compared to each other or in different species?
Mhm.
Yeah.
That is such a great question. Yeah, so I guess there are ways of quantifying ichno disparity. Obviously, the ethological approach would be a very good one. And what I have hypothesized is that we're getting different ichnotaxa mimicking a very similar kind of behavior in a very similar type of stratigraphic or sedimentary facies system repeatedly. And so I would argue then that although the ichnotaxonomy changes, the ichnodisparity does not change so much. It's the same types of strategies that are being successful. And in a very stressful time, as was the late Devonian, it's perhaps understandable that organisms are coming and going, but that there is a successful strategy which seems to be living in a shallow burrow eating mud. Um, have I understood correctly your reference to ichnodisparity?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Yeah, I just want to say what a really interesting set of questions, and I appreciate it from everyone. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chris, and our audience for having such a great seminar and interaction after the talk. So yes, thank you everyone again for joining us. And I did not update the slide, but okay, we don't have a talk scheduled for until 26th May. So I'm sorry about this. Let's join back in 2 minutes for our informal tea time. Uh, so yeah, like stretch, walk around, and we'll be back in 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.